It feels like we have too much time and not enough purpose because we have,
Hmm.
like, if we go back to like thinking about, I think sitting here talking about death and our unhealthy relationship to death, like food, we have to eat and we all have to die. These are inevitable truths in our lives, whether it's on a daily or over a lifespan, but they seem to be the things that we mess up the most. And it's almost because either we can't reconcile it or we don't have enough time to consider it or consider its relationship to us, or we have too much time to think about the relationship that is eating and dying. I don't know what it is, but it's funny how these simple facts, these simple realities, simple truths become corrupted the most. And I wonder if it's because of that. Everyone must eat, everyone must die. Therefore, it's like you said, everyone must get their hair cut. Maybe barbers are next. It's
Hmm.
food, death, and barbers.
Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the
Broadcast from later. We're exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their significance. A weak signal is just something we notice that we don't fully understand yet, but we suspect it might be meaningful in shaping the futures of our lives and society. It's an event, an idea, an issue, or some other emergent development. At From Later, we're steady soaking up the signals and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on these broadcasts, we're giving a glimpse of the early part of the foresight process. This is what it looks like when you're trying to understand something you don't know anything about. It's basically structured like show and tell. A few of us each bring in a signal we've noticed. The rest of us do not know what that item is in advance. Collectively, we try to make sense of it and speculate on where it might lead. If you're listening and you feel lost and you don't understand what we're talking about, it's not a problem. Neither do we. This is literally the newest stuff we know about. And if you're listening and you like what you hear, you think it's a good idea to practice this practice, I encourage you to formalize something like it with your friends and peers and let us know. Like, subscribe, comment, and otherwise get at us with your feedback. Tell us what you think should join one of these conversations. We're always curious to know. And if you have critical feedback, we're interested in that too. These are new ideas that we're trying to make sense of and evolve and take to new places. As always, I don't know anything. Everybody's just trying to figure it out as we go. On today's Zoom call, we have myself, Robert Bolton, our producer, Jeremy Glenn, Sydney Allen Ash, zooming in from New York, Julienne DeVita, a design futures professional, joins from DC. Julienne also teaches in the Foresight Studies and Speculative Design program at Parsons, the new school. Check out her new podcast, Eating Tomorrow. Daniel Anthony Daam-Rossi is also here. Daniel is co-founder of the Spec Design Studio, Radical Norms. He's joining from Toronto. Thank you both for coming. I met both of you within like a 1 week span in spring, I guess. And just sort of, I think around then I was like, oh, this would make a really good podcast. So that seemed like the right energy. Have you two crossed paths at all? Or do you know each other already? Or?
I don't think we've crossed paths.
No, good to meet you both.
Daniel is from Radical Norms. What would you call it? What kind of studio is it?
Speculative design. I'll say that confidently here because I know you know what that is.
Yeah. Are you still teaching in Toronto?
Yeah, one OCAD, one George Brown this semester, and then next semester, both OCAD. Yeah, so 2 and 2. Yeah, it's nice.
What do you teach, Daniel?
So this semester, I'm teaching communicating through form, which is basically teaching industrial designers how to present their work through storytelling and whatnot. And then I'm also teaching digital systems and software. So kind of historical contextualization of computers, internet devices, things like that, and then having them break down experiences for digital products and services from like a user perspective, stakeholder perspective, and then kind of they create their own experience. And then next semester, I'm teaching speculative design, second year. So we piloted the first spec design course at OCAD last year, doing it again this year. And a course called Body Object Digital Space, which is sort of integrating rapid prototyping processes in the design process. So how to integrate laser cutting, 3D printing, stuff like that.
That's awesome. You're another like spec design course starting. That's great. I teach in the professional education department at Parsons.
Cool.
And we have a spec design and future study certificate. So that's probably my favorite to teach.
Awesome. How long have you been teaching at Parsons?
Going on like a year and a half. I started teaching the speculative design features course like in January of this year. And then prior to that, I taught at the undergraduate level, like the BBA design thesis course and creativity, AI, and social justice, and a couple other courses. Yeah, it's a different vibe, but it's a great time.
Yeah, I feel like it's interesting because like you do this as a practitioner, but articulating it to students who haven't necessarily ever done this is a whole other level of like understanding what you do.
Oh, totally. Forget how many questions there can be about even just like what a signal is. And it's really nice to have that question just keep coming up because it keeps you on your toes.
Yes. Do you find that when you're onboarding and discussing things like what a signal is, and you have your version, right, like of what it might be and what it could be, and what people have written about it, and then students come up with like, but what about this? Like, do you ever like? I'm always taken by how students kind of conceptualize it for themselves without having these preconceptions of like, and this person said this and that person said that. Like, do you get that from your students as well?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think it's a little bit of like familiarity with design. It ranges with my students. So for the design researchers, sometimes there are like more questions, which is really interesting. And wrapping my head around like describing what a signal is going to be totally different for two totally different learners through brains. And I think that helps me. But yeah, I get it all the time.
I love those moments because you kind of like caught off guard, but at the same time it's exciting because you're recontextualizing it on the fly.
I was resonating with your conversation of teaching because I was teaching at a college in Toronto the past couple of years. And it is just so refreshing to have like 18-year-olds make you question, like, do I know anything at all? Like at any time about anything? Like, am I a big fat phony in every single area of my life?
Yeah.
Just like the simplest question can really like knock you off your rocker,
I know. Because you also feel like you have to have the answers. I know, like, I think I've relaxed a little bit in the past couple of years. In the beginning, I was just like, because you're new to this and they're paying money for this. So you're like, you have to, come with the answers and have it all the time and be on all the time. But I think once I've started to relax a little bit into it, I'm just like, well, I don't know. Let's discuss this. What do you think it is?
That's a good rhetorical tool. What do you think? You guys.
Yeah, totally.
Totally.
As I sit there writing down.
Yeah.
Julienne, tell us about the podcast that you've launched.
We worked with US Soy, which is an interesting client. Why does soy care about the future food? Maybe is your reaction, but we sold this speculative narrative podcast. It's a 5-episode series that weaves together histories and rituals of food with like science and education and innovation. And we really just discussed shared food futures and primarily was an educational podcast. Every episode have a different theme. And probably the most exciting part about the podcast was after conducting all the research and interviews that goes into it, we had designed 5 different speculative artifacts or experiences regarding like the future of food. So maybe the first 90 seconds of every episode has an artifact that doesn't really exist yet. And listeners are just thrown into like 2 minutes of maybe advertisement from the future or something like that.
Right.
Trying to get folks to have the reaction like, what am I listening to? Like, what is this? And then we just dive right into the topics that are alluded to in the speculative narrative shorts. So it's really fun, a lot of work, but yeah, it felt exciting to bring speculative design to like an audio format and something that's educational, but also pretty like centered on storytelling.
That's really cool.
Yeah. It's the exact format that Sid and I did a podcast, Workplace Futures. It was like start with an audio scenario, speculative artifact, essentially. Really a speculative artifact, like a piece of sound that actually would exist in some sort of file form or whatever in the future. One was an advertisement, and others were like recordings from an AI assistant in an office and just different things like that. And then Sid proceeded to like host a conversation with the founders of the client that was sponsoring it and guests to discuss the futures of working place. It seems intuitive as like a format, and plus I've definitely been like pushing to do more speculative audio for years now, so that's awesome to hear.
Oh yeah, I mean that sounds super exciting. I think as speculative futures becomes like slowly but surely like a bit larger of a community, there's like an openness to exploring these new forms and like paid work opportunities, which is nice, because previously sometimes it just comes from like my own artistic research projects that are on the side or what have you. It's really interesting to be able to explore and play.
It's cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward. I'm gonna listen to it ASAP. It's out now, all of them, or?
Yeah, it's called Eating Tomorrow. It's a 5-episode. Each just like probably 25 to 30 minutes. Not even. All on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Cool. Well, we can get started. Daniel, why don't you go first? What's your weakest signal?
Actually, this is inspired by a lot of what Sid brought on when you talk about replica AI, which was blowing my mind. That was insane. Just the relationships that we're building towards AI applications and, the rights that we have to or not to these entities that we're building relationships with. But from that, I guess this, I don't know if it's a weak signal, but the signal that I'm kind of fascinated by right now, it's coming out of UC San Francisco. They developed this neuroprosthesis. So basically, like there's an electrocardiography grid that they've surgically implanted into the brain of a patient. So in this case, her name is Anne. So at 30, Anne suffered a stroke and paralyzed her entirely in what is known as locked-in syndrome. So she's completely paralyzed. She can't move her muscles except for those of the eye and the mouth. And they created this AI appliance that basically this grid that's in her brain picks up signals that are related to speech. And they also scan her eye movements and they translate these like non-auditory signals into live audio. So Anne is now able to like have conversations in real time and through an avatar. So she has this matrix style thing coming out of her skull that they plug into, and there's these wires that come out of it.
Wow.
It feeds into a computer that processes these signals and also takes into consideration like her movements of her eyes. It translates that into live speech and then puts that live speech or that live text into an avatar that they've created that's sort of like similar likeness to her. And that avatar speaks for her. It was mind blowing, but she literally plugged in. That's the only thing and she's the first person to have this implant. And I think they're saying that they're working on more, I guess, less intrusive versions, more wireless versions. I don't know. That seems kind of far away right now, but I just found it fascinating because a lot of these AI, I guess you could say, representations of individuals are usually constructs or facsimiles, but this is literally her.
Right.
This is the only way that she can communicate with people. And it's like, how does this change infrastructure? How like she's, it's essentially in a wheelchair and she has this avatar with her all the time. That's the only way that she can converse now.
Amazing.
How does the avatar like show up? Like she has a screen with her, or it's only like it's...
Yeah. She's in a room in a wheelchair. Next to her sitting, it's like her partner is sitting there, and they were married and she suffered her stroke after they were married. And since then, I think they've had 2 kids. So she's sitting next to her partner who she hasn't had a conversation with besides this like very like to this tool where it's like a cheap glasses with a laser with words. And she kind of points to those, like a very slow way of creating text.
Yeah.
Formulating sentences. But so she's in this room and these wires are coming out of her head and they're plugged into this computer where they have this, like they're processing these signals and it translates it into speech. And then from there, there's another screen. That screen is her avatar. And her avatar is in front of her husband and them. And it's basically saying what she's thinking. And they're going back and forth. So the avatar, she thinks, computer processes, avatar speaks, husband's like, receives it, says something back, she thinks, and it goes back in this loop of communicating through this crazy system, which for me was mind blowing and what it's like this AI application, what it's enabling people who are in this state of not being able to communicate.
Just so I'm understanding, the eyes then are being used kind of like a cursor or something, like it's to point essentially.
No.
Or
so no. The eye, I think they're triangulating a few things. They're taking signals from the brain. They're taking movements of the eyes. So like like excitement or
okay.
to provide emphasis on what's being said, and also to map it to the avatar as well to kind of get somewhat facial features that are accurate to what she's saying.
Interesting.
And then somewhat her mouth as well. So it's more like, it's like three factors that they're taking into consideration when constructing this playback that this avatar is saying.
Gotcha. Yeah. I ask because I'm super interested in the intelligence of the eye at the moment. And it's something I've been exploring with my partner, as this artist, Suvana Miranda Civili. At first I was like, are they reading something that I didn't know could be read yet about the eyes? But the intelligence of the eye is just fascinating because it really seems to have its own mind, the way that it saccades and seeks and finds what it values and so on.
Yes. It's instinctual, right? Even it's like you're subconscious in a way.
And the whole mystery of dilation and arousal and things like that, of what, why our eyes do that, why our eyes dilate when we're interested in something.
It must take into consideration these elements, because just like these signals, speech is nothing, right? It's like reading a book, right? It's your inner voice or the narrator's voice that kind of brings the words to life. And I wonder, in essence, these little signals must be what are giving this otherwise flat avatar expression, to an ability to somehow emote or as closely as possible to what Anne is feeling, even though she's not able to express it actually.
It's interesting how there's so many factors communicating with one another to then output language. Just make me think about how much of how we communicate is actually not really relevant to words and language, like nonverbal expression and emotional expression and eye tracking movement. There's so much temperature control, how far will this go? What happens when there's many different senses, eyes watering, dry mouth, right? Where could you take this with sensory tracking? And it's very interesting and powerful
as a way to compound, right? To build that expression of an avatar that's the most accurate version of what they're feeling in a way.
This is blowing my mind right now. It's just I've just been watching this video on mute while you guys are talking. And it's so beautiful because, this is the most kind of meaningful and altruistic application of all this technology that has been bringing about so much doom, or doom conversations. And this is just this is truly life-changing for this woman, The other thing that I just thought about, while Julienne, you brought up just all of the nonverbal cues that exist within communication, it just made me think about the subtlety and the intimacy that Anne and her partner or ex-partner, I'm not sure where they're at based on your description, but to understand each other, because she understands what's going on, she's just not able to express that in the ways that we would. And so just even prior to having this implant, the intimacy of their communication, the subtlety with which he was able to read her, because that's totally real as well.
Mm-hmm. It must be an insane experience because they were married, then she had her stroke. So he has a whole experience of who she was.
Yeah.
And then who she is currently, which is, she's still there, right? This is what's mind blowing. She is there. She's able to process complex thought and feeling and all these things. She's not able to physically express it.
Yeah.
And then to have this other evolution of her, which is now this avatar version, this 2-dimensional version of her, which is sort of, in a way, picking a piece of the way that they actually modeled her voice was from her wedding speech. So they took the speech she gave at her wedding. They used that as the data to create the representation of the avatar. So I can't even imagine what he's feeling in this moment. It's worlds colliding of an individual in a format that he would have thought of. And then you have to kind of also find a way to build a relationship to this now. I don't know. It's a very interesting situation emotionally.
Yeah. The other thing that I think about with this, and I think about this all the time, I'm obsessed with the dictionary app on my laptop, on my MacBook. Mm-hmm. I use it constantly, all the time, every single day. And I just think it's the best app there is. And, and I think about how it is also influencing the evolution of language, because you look up synonyms for, exciting, and there's only a certain amount there, and it's not all the synonyms, like you can go into a dictionary and go into other websites or whatever, and you can find other synonyms. And so to bring that back to the point here, I think about like, what vocabulary bank is this pulling from to be able to interpret her language? And what kind of feedback loop does that have on her and in her relationships? Like even prior to this implant, I was kind of watching the video, and it's like she was kind of spelling stuff out, but maybe there were some words she could pick from as well. It wasn't quite clear from just scanning it quickly. I mean, her autonomy period has obviously been so massively impacted, but even just the autonomy of language and speech, and therefore the autonomy of thought, how that has been impacted by the limits of whatever vocabulary she's been provided. Like the first thing that I thought about, which like maybe my previous signal was also an indication of this, is like, oh, maybe they can like have like some type of like intimate sexual interactions via, like maybe they can talk now, they could have like a sexy combo. And surely they were, I don't know, maybe not surely, but like, because we're talking about like the range of nonverbal communication, like maybe they had been able to do that before, but like, yeah, like I was just had the captions on the video and it was going, and it was like, I think you're great, or I think you're wonderful, or something like that, and like, oh, that's one of the first things she chooses to say. How beautiful is that, like, and yeah, it just makes me think about like, oh, she actually has so much more power now that she can talk.
Yes. It reminded me a little bit of like Her, the movie, in reverse, where instead of like falling in love with an algorithm, you're still in love with your physical partner, but this avatar is the medium.
Yeah.
Between.
Yeah. So interesting, because it's not quite a mediator. It's not like a replacement of her because it's there beside her, which like, I think that positionality and relationship is a departure from how we have like, at least in movies, kind of depicted how avatars will run everything, which is like they are a one-to-one replacement, but this is like an accessory, and so it's kind of something slightly different, where watching the videos, like she is giving nonverbal communication cues while the avatar is saying things. So there's actually two layers, if not more, of communication going on simultaneously by having this as her accessory, right? She like communicates something, or like makes it communicate something, and she looks over. It's like, did you get that? Like, and it's so fascinating because it's actually like there's two things. This is not her. This is just an additional. It's like a seventh sense or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, how does this change over time too? Like, I got to thinking, like, well, what happens if you use this with a child versus someone in their 20s, someone in their 50s? Like, how would that change things as like just naturally you change as a person, like your facial expressions change, and maybe that's partially biological. Maybe part of that is just what life does to you, and like think about how this is learning like alongside the person would be really like an interesting study. I mean, also like it's so transparent. Like part of why I think this sort of application of AI is inspiring is not just because of like the wonderful things that it's doing for this person or how it's collaborating with this human, but it's because it feels like overly transparent. Like we know that it's tracking her eyes to do this, or it's reading her lips, or the twitch of her face, or her blinks, and her pupils. So like by knowing that, there's like, for me, there's more trust because there's just more information on how the data is collected versus so many tools out there that are a little bit less collaborative and or transparent. So I think that's also like a side of why I feel so inspired by it.
Yeah, the question you asked of the child versus someone who has a longer past is really interesting. And Daniel, I think you were saying right before that, she's also witnessing herself. And so being able to have this response of how true or authentic or reflection it feels. And I mean, it makes me think of the way everyone comments about how cringe it is to listen to yourself recorded. This is like some other, layer of whatever you want to call this, production or something between, kind of thought and expression or interpretation rather than production, maybe. But there's some amount of like designing oneself as well and how one is expressed in the world that you don't have as much in real time. Our experience like that maybe comes more from, places where we are a little bit more produced or curated, like online. But it kind of opens, new possibilities in that way.
It's interesting to think about because Anne's 30, right? She's had quite a lot of life, not a lot, but a lot of life to experiences, be exposed to things, go through different whatever through life. Like if you were to juxtapose that with someone who's younger, perhaps that this might help, who is unable to speak, and similar to what you're saying, Sid, in the sense of like, this dictionary app where you all of a sudden you have an openness to curate and expand your vocabulary in a way that maybe you didn't before. Like you're almost constructing an entity with the infinite database that is accessible to you. And so I wonder what the difference would be in terms of how we evolve someone who's younger, someone who's older going through this, or someone who has an experience and someone who's creating experiences or experiences that have the ability to kind of go back into the archives and augment that experience in whatever which way they can and make it richer, deeper, more interesting, more, it's a different way of evolving, I guess, because it's, and to your point, Julienne, like it's human data, right? That is extracted and used.
What is like a multimedia format of communication for this look like too? I'm starting to think it's like, it's like her presence and her energy still in the room. So there is also that. So like how could this get even more dynamic?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It just makes me think about like all the plugins that exist in like Adobe Creative Cloud and like that program Runway where there is like AI generated media, AI generated video and stills, and you can highlight a section on Photoshop and be like, generate a daisy, and like how would it work if you could connect this implant that Anne has into a software like that so she could start to paint, and start to tell stories and start to, like, or like explain memories, like just or like visualize feelings or what, all the various things you can do with more rich tools. Super interesting.
Well, I get really curious about what happens when this becomes networked, like when you have just direct from one person to another and the avatar is cut out of the equation potentially.
Oh, I see.
And what that means. And to speculate, does this bring us to something that's improving quality of communication, that's potentially better than language as a technology for communicating with one another? And, you hear people talk about the reasons for these brain-computer interfaces beyond for cases like this, but I think like Elon Musk talks about like the throughput of language essentially, or of reading or of typing with the thumbs on your phone, stuff not being efficient enough. And I always hear that and wonder like, well, there's like an assumption of how much the brain is like a computer, and would, uploading something to the brain actually be tenable? Would it be pleasant? Would it be extremely unpleasant? Or would it not really do that much in the sense that you would just have access? Like, okay, the throughput is a little bit less, but you're essentially doing maybe a more energy inefficient way, a more draining sort of way of searching Wikipedia to find the answer. And it's sort of like you've kind of removed a step, but you're kind of going through the same process. And it doesn't do that much it's convenient, but we are kind of already have that convenience, and it doesn't do that much for your intelligence. But what gets interesting is this question about the necessity of language. How necessary is language? And could we come across some kind of more direct or hybrid way of accurate expression? Because language has so many flaws that part of those flaws are what give it its generative power. But is the capacity to misunderstand someone is part of the generative power of language, I think. But
as you're talking, I'm thinking about like the kind of adjectives that you're using to define success, or to define like this different state we would reach. And, hearing things like efficiency or accuracy, like, well, those aren't the things that I think about when I'm trying to figure out how to communicate something rich to somebody else, like we're talking about how to make Anne's communication richer, or just communication in this mode richer, right? And I'm like accuracy is not totally what I'm aiming for. Efficiency is definitely not it, but like resonance, like enveloping someone in the feeling that I have, like wanting to wrap it around them like a blanket, like that's but like I want immersive, I want engaging, I want transcendent, I want these bigger and fuller endpoints. Like that's what I want, is like I want to immerse someone in like a 360-degree pool that has screens in it and surround sound, and I can make waves with my brain. Like that's what I want, like I don't want just like, how can I articulate this particular word as accurately as I possibly can, and let me scan the millions of words in the dictionary of the internet to find the word. Like that's not what I want, like I want feeling,
Yeah, but I would counter that just by saying, okay, I understand the connotations of accuracy and why you feel that way, but I would say that everything you're describing is about having a, maybe nuanced is better than, but I would maybe combine accurate and nuanced, a nuanced way of expressing, because that I think is what you're doing, right? And so I would sort of disagree with you in the sense that like it's about, if I can most effectively communicate the thing in a haiku instead of in a book length work or whatever, and you know what I mean, that haiku could be all the things you described in terms of it being moving and enveloping and stuff like that, but also efficient according to number of words and things like that. Maybe not in terms of the time spent on it. Maybe the haiku takes just as long to think through as 20 pages or whatever. And I think this is an example of the challenge of connotation and the word accuracy in this case, of sort of like, and through this dialogue, we're kind of like getting to a place of mutual understanding together. And that's sort of where accuracy and ambiguity are not even exclusive, that actually a certain amount of ambiguity might be the most necessary thing to accurately convey the feeling or the thing that you're trying to express. But these are all sort of the levers that you play with language to try to express.
Blank space, and how are our systems of language actually constricting, but what happens with like you were saying with the haiku, like when you bring other elements of artistic or creative expression to language, then it's like an entirely new world you're walking into. And this is like some of the research I'm doing right now directly relates, which is just trying to better understand how emotions are at the deep-seated root of anything that's going to happen. It starts there. And I feel like it's the same with language too. It's taking something that's intangible in some sense and making it more tangible, or maybe better translated and communicated, shared. Like to your point, Sid, like that feeling of bringing someone else into your own world it resonates so much. And for me, it doesn't always with language. Like funny how I work fully remote, because it's like so much of that is lost, like over this, like how, like I'm only able to express so much right now on this call, and how I'm constantly trying to think of ways to bend that, to break that. And it's tough when the system's kind of set up this way,
I mean, I can barely understand you without your shoulders right now. We're lost in it.
We're just floating.
Imagine hooking this thing up to like that sphere in Vegas, talking to like Sydney, like you're talking about like, being immersed in a performance, in an expression, like that would be insane, right? Because as an artist, you're creating, language is a medium just as much as visual images, whatever. But this is a direct line to the initial impulse of creativity, of creation, of a thought, of wanting to express something. Imagine that is hardwired into like this massive like sphere that, like you said, it's interesting. The tool, which is an extension of your arm, your hand, and your brain, that shortens, right? That it's like literally plugged in. There's no more length anymore to the tool. But the tool is your brain.
That's the question, though, is like, to what, like, is it a direct line, and to what extent can we actually like dissolve the interface, I guess? And like potentially, yes. And that's why I'm so interested in this, like sort of direct, like what happens when you cut out the avatar? Because once the avatar is there, the language generation, which yeah, I'm super interested in whether it's exactly like you're thinking these words and it's presenting them, or you're thinking an idea abstractly and it's generating the words for you.
Yeah.
But what those things can look like. But yeah, I mean, the potential of being able to send a message of thoughts to someone else that includes some memory that you have, some kind of complex connotation and sort of network of ideas that exist in your own mind, various things you've read or ways that you've been influenced over connotation, and maybe if all of that could be expressed as a feeling where someone else can get the thought and feeling, which might be very arbitrary distinction, right? That's like something that's happened in language. I was just reading this book on dialogue by Bohm, and he talks a lot about how like this idea that thoughts and feelings are distinct is just like kind of a error of thought in itself, that that these things are actually much more one. So I mean, I think language tries to deal with that problem in some ways, but it also, fails to deal with that problem at times. But yeah, the idea that we could express sort of thought and feeling and it to just land with someone directly is going to be an exciting thing to experiment with.
There's this essay by James Wood, and I think it was Serious Noticing or something else that he wrote. And he talks about the role of criticism. And he talks about how, kind of in its highest form, criticism is like, you watch someone play a piano, you went to a performance, someone played the piano. And in your criticism, in your work of criticism, you're trying to play the piano again for the reader. Like, here, let me play it for you, kind of thing. And I think that's a really beautiful interpretation of what criticism or art or language is. It's like I actually want to like recreate this for you in some way. And so, when Anne turns to her partner, is like, I think you're wonderful. It's like thinking about this multimedia, potential future of this technology feels really, really beautiful and really impactful, because you could like actually recreate something kind of deeper, like I could just replay for you, when you made me dinner, or when you held my hand, or when you, like, and how, like, I don't even have to tell you that, like, I don't have to explain anything more. I can just show you this thing that I'm thinking and feeling right now, and that seems really interesting to me.
Yeah. We did a project once called the Memory Cloud Apparatus, which is looking at a future when you could basically download your loved one who is passing away, their memories, and absorb them as your own. And this sort of is reminiscent of that. And at that point, like, this was 70 years ago, we were thinking about this, and now it's like I'm seeing it. It's sort of like, it's interesting to see it starting to manifest, but it's also interesting to see its like manifestation through this very hardwired wires coming out of a brain, and what it will be when it becomes relatively seamless, and when it's not just people or patients, but it's any one individual who wants to have these interfaces.
Yeah, I'm working on a series of speculative interviews or speculative dialogues for this magazine, Newest, Canadian arts magazine, and we're working with several artists to have conversations with the past. And that could be an ancestor, a past version of themselves, any figure from the past, a historical figure, anything. That's just sort of a way of, really making literal in language something that we're all doing, dialoguing with the past, with everything we do. It's constantly kind of flowing through. And yeah, we've been thinking about, like, okay, what are the various techniques to have conversation with the past? And there are, many, and there are more sort of spiritual or, like less technical ways, I guess, that people use of channeling or even just free writing. But apparently about half to 3/4 of people report sensing the presence of the deceased. So it's like extremely common. And I think even among people who are sort of like would identify as like rationalist or not necessarily believe in those things, people sense or dream about, or in other ways have these kinds of relationships with past. So it's very interesting. You brought this up with reference to Replica. There's this Project December thing where you can simulate the dead for $10 a service. Project December.
That's a thing?
Yeah. It does. It exists. I don't know where it's at the moment, but yeah. And there's a name for this. It's called Thanabots. The idea of creating AIs that represent the deceased. But it's like, it seems to be one of the applications of LLMs and robotics and other AI technologies that there's some kind of obsession with, for sure.
Like just sex and death always. That's like how technology first gets applied. This reminds me of I think it was a Radiolab episode where like a video game developer somehow interpreted their lost loved one and turned it into kind of just like one of those video games where there's no real point. You're just kind of exploring an environment. And I believe the episode ended with like eventually this person like deleted the game, like ended the game and deleted the game because you're like fabricating a person. You're like, yes, you know them intimately and you're doing your best, but like you're fabricating like a static person that doesn't evolve and grow and change. And like the falsity in that keeps you stagnant also. And so I'm sure it is temporarily incredibly beneficial and supportive to be able to, engage with a proxy of your loved one. I don't know if it's like, spiritually beneficial on like a macro level for us to be able to do that. Like, I think it's just like indicative of our cultural resistance to loss and death, like we're just so opposed to change that we're like, no, we will keep everyone alive forever, and even I think about this to go back to Anne and the brain implant is like, in thinking about and reading about like traumatic brain injuries, it's like the stimulus and like it's just brain health in general is like new stimulus is what keeps your brain healthy, is what keeps your brain growing, like preventing it from atrophying. And so like, I wonder, in the scenario, if this brain implant was given to someone much younger, how can it learn and grow with them to prevent that kind of stagnancy, to prevent us uploading a version of themselves, these are your 10,000 words and these are the only words you can use, and this is the formulation of the words. Like it needs to be able to grow and change and evolve with this person. Otherwise, they are essentially just like an uploaded version of themselves because they're so limited by the capacity of this avatar.
But going back to like avoiding loss of others, but also like losing of yourself. And then what happens when you bring in the individual while they're living into the design of the thing that is going to be communicating or interacting with others while they're gone? And then does that actually provide more service for that person versus the people who might use that going forward? I don't know. Like, is it even right? Yeah, to do any of this work without that person being involved in the process? Sure, I would love that, but some people might. So
yeah,
who's it for? And it makes me think about that.
Yeah, and what's it for? What, like if we're creating these digital, avatars as a way of coping with grief, like they need a time limit on them. Otherwise you can just stay in the past forever. And I think the question of who it's for is really interesting. Like, what if this were a tool for someone who did know they have a terminal illness and they can use it to kind of explore themselves, like in a kind of final way, like kind of like an interactive journal or something like that.
I always think about that too. Is like, I've actually literally thought about this before. Like, I should start writing myself letters for a time in my life where I lose someone or I'm about to go, and just like let them, very much like a tangible thing, because I think letters are romantic and they're tactile. There's something beautiful in like the tactile nature of like media that you save. And it's interesting to think too, like I have probably more photos on my phone than anyone I know, and I'm just like working through deleting them. But then part of me is also like, am I even gonna look at these anytime soon? Is there a way that I could make these more than just like a scroll on my phone every once a year looking at some stuff? I don't know. Like, what's the point in archiving so much, and how does that take away from living it? A lot of flurries of questions.
Signal or noise, Sid?
Is it a signal in the strict definition of a signal? No, because it's already here. But I guess there are potential signal evolutions that could come from this. So it's a fertile non-signal.
Julianne, what do you think?
I feel like it could pass as a signal. I think the conversations that come from this sort of tech are making me think about even more novel signals. You know, I think that the tech itself is interesting, but the conversations that it brings around language and constraint versus creativity are like so interesting. I do think that like it is maybe a needed positive reminder of AI in this moment, which feels more novel than some of the like AI do signal just trends that you're seeing, you know? I'd say so.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a signal in the sense of the conversations that it generated. I might say that it's like the two of you by saying it passes as a signal convinced me that like, oh, maybe there's noise. But I would put that noise under like the category of like progress. I always think it's tough when you're looking at like direct latest scientific progress because of the way science happens. It's like it's not usually this sort of like, I mean, it's described as a breakthrough in this case, but like it's never this one event. So many of the conversations we're talking about have come to my mind, and I'm kind of bringing up again because of signals that we've seen. So for balance, I'll call it noise, but I could go either way, as always. The whole game's a sham and everyone's. I'm going to deliver a signal because I'm kind of curious whether it intersects with this one well or not. It's something called Flipper Zero. It's a hacking tool for security testing, ostensibly. So you can use this device to like identify vulnerabilities in different systems and find bugs that might be exploited. It says on their website that Flipper Zero is a portable multi-tool for pen testers and geeks in a toy-like body. Pen tests are penetration tests, so that's kind of cybersecurity jargon. But basically, it's this little computer with a number of radios and different frequencies that do different things. It's a multi-tool. Basically, the majority of what it can do, it has been able to be done for a very long time. And you know, everything it could do could be done with commercially available electronics and homemade. So it's got things like near field communication chip, NFC chip, which is used in like, I think, credit cards and Metro cards and phones, RFID, and several other devices. So they call it a multi-tool and your cyber buddy. And yeah, it's this little computer transceiver. And sort of you can see all the various things you could do with it. Basically, it allows you to capture, record, and play back a signal, which is what you do in what's called playback attacks. So essentially, someone with this could drive by and while you're unlocking your car, capture that signal, keep that signal, and come back and unlock your car. And so there's a lot of potential for, pretty serious cybercrime and hacking and stuff. And while all of this stuff would be available, it's basically now been packaged in this very convenient tool that has a little dolphin and is kind of packaged like a toy. It's become really big on TikTok and, you know, reading the reviews and stuff like that. There's a lot of like what reads to me as like the next Kevin McAllister of Home Alone. There's something about it that is so like the way this mischievous kid was using like the Talkboy recorder or something, and just like the whole sort of attitude, and has that, it's like that's almost the appeal that it seems to be driving and attracting. And it can do a lot. It has like probably the most easily used for nefarious practices thing on it is that it has this brute force capability built in. So you can go through every signal to open up a garage door in succession if you have the time to sit there and do it. And there have been, let's see.
I want one.
Was it, you want one? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw it and I was like, oh, I want this. And I guess you could use it for convenient things. But I mean, the idea is that you could use it to find out where there are vulnerabilities in like your own smart home or whatever, and just become aware of those things. You could also use it for a whole bunch of bad stuff. It's been compared to Game Shark. I think there's uses for this in unlocking video games in certain ways. I don't know enough to even know exactly how that would work. You can modify it in many ways. And it has been banned in Brazil. A whole shipment was seized at the U.S. Customs Border Patrol. And I think those did later get delivered because it's not illegal. Amazon said they'd stop selling it because it can be used for card skimming. I was thinking of like, what would happen if you have one of these and you have your own credit card on it and you go and try and purchase something like via tap? So anything that you could do via tap where you don't have to put a PIN in, you could essentially do that. And I suppose if it was your own card and you have the PIN or whatever, you could do that as well. And would someone bat an eye? Would they care? Like, you already do that with your phone. It would probably be pretty doable through a phone if you've modified it the right way anyways. So again, like, all of this is available. It's just the way that it's been packaged, the momentum that it's gaining, the fact that it's been selling out and actually being resold for like $1,000. I think they go for like 200 or something regular price, and then they're going for like 600 to 1,000 when they're not in stock for people who want them. But it is kind of like this perfect cybercrime device, but also the antidote to that. It can be used by black hat or white hat hackers. And, Amazon not selling it. I was listening to like a cybersecurity podcast and researching this called Cyber Security Cocktail Hour, just to shout out them for giving me some of these thoughts and ideas. The cybersecurity professional on the podcast was like, this is kind of like saying Amazon's going to stop selling knives, because while you can chop up your fruit with it, you could also rob somebody or whatever. So the idea that it's a tool, and obviously you can do nefarious things with many tools, many, power tools, vehicles, any type of thing. So that's my signal.
That analogy, like they're going to stop selling knives because you could stab someone, it's like a little bit of a false equivalency. It's like saying like, yeah, I could open a beer bottle with a gun, but like that's not really what we're talking about here. Like the most interesting thing about this to me is the way it's so innocently branded, so cute and playful. It looks like a little toy. And I wonder, like, hearing that it's popular on TikTok is really interesting to me, because there's something, and I don't know if this is just like kind of a dramatic overstatement, but like, is it like democratizing his hacking a little bit, which is kind of funny to say because hacking is in itself intended to be kind of democratic. But like, I'm not a hacker. I don't personally know anybody who is. And so this tool kind of like puts a bunch of disparate, approaches to hacking something into a very easy to use little gadget. And in that way, it could enable more people to hack stuff. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. It depends on what you're hacking, but it is interesting to see, I guess, more than democratizing, it's actually commercializing hacking, which is actually like addresses a tension that is more interesting. Hacking is not a commercial act, or I don't know, maybe I can't say one or the other, what's commercial and what's not, but it is a very cute little device you can buy to then circumvent buying things potentially,
Look, it's gamifying a little bit. Yeah. Like it looks to me like a little mini game,
like a Tamagotchi.
Probably.
Yeah, like play this game, and so almost like in that sense, you can win the game or you can lose the game. I guess you could do like the black hat, white hat. You could do good things. I guess you could do, not so good things with this, but can this be hacked? I start wonder that, like, is this truly like a key, or is it just another device that checks other devices, but could also be somehow hacked into? At first, I'm like, I want one, and then I'm like, I don't trust this. Part of
that's a good point. I mean, getting any sort of thing like this apparently from a shady source, or even one that is actually coming from like a more verified source, is dangerous, apparently, according to the podcast I listened to. And we've all probably heard of this. Like, if you buy like a cheap Apple charger or whatever, plug that into your computer, there could very easily be malicious spyware or whatever on it already. And that's hard for you to even notice or detect. And apparently that's common when you buy these types of devices as well, that there might be something already on it. I don't know that I've seen any reports with this particular organization, but that could definitely happen. And they advise, do not ever accept something like this for free from anyone. So it's not the holiday gift to send off to someone. If your partner gives it to you, they may be trying to spy on you.
I mean, it is funny and cute though, like I have these contradicting feelings of trust.
Yeah, the branding is what makes it very interesting to me. A couple of things. Said you mentioned it's like a Tamagotchi. It actually is like a Tamagotchi. It does exactly what a Tamagotchi does with that little flipper dolphin mascot. So when you bring multiple of them together, there's some way for them to network and play and form an ecosystem, just like a Tamagotchi. So it has this
I see.
this thing, and it's like, okay, is that meant to encourage white hat hacking and like is that meant to like make this more fun so more people are more vigilant about their own cybersecurity, or is it like making this into something that's like a toy that could be very used for very mischievous purposes? And like just going through what's on social media, and someone added it to their everyday carry along with like their switchblade and like a thing where it's like, okay, it's like a certain multi-tool user demographic, and without making any judgment about what that person's doing, but it was just sort of like that gives it a particular vibe. And then there's a lot of stuff on TikTok that's very much playing into the Mr. Robot, hackers, the net sort of, and even like, Home Alone, like excitement, sexiness of using a device to unlock something or to, access something, very kind of spy movie oriented. And apparently these are somewhat like exaggerated and sensationalized, these videos. So the other side of that was mentioned on this podcast was that, on the other hand, maybe it's just the world's most expensive universal remote, and it's like, because actually these are kind of boring things that it does that you could access. And if you wanted to do this, and it still takes quite a bit of, there's like anyone can buy this, and all of a sudden, without knowing anything, you're going to be able to do all of these things. It makes it easier. It certainly makes it seem cooler, seem more fun maybe than what it actually is. And that could attract certain people, but it's working. Like, that's the thing. The branding on it is working. And I don't know. It's like, maybe this is just part of the inevitability of data breach, and that's these things are going to happen. We all need to be thinking about them more. And there just needs to be more white hat hackers, because of the way that we've continually broadened our attack surfaces by getting, smart light bulbs or whatever.
Yeah. We're generally very naive to the technology that we use every day. So I think things like this are quite interesting in that, like you said, whether from a perspective of a child or a kid who wants to learn how these things work, or even an adult, I think just having an accessible interface for knowing how technology works. Like you said, like, this is just the next version of the Talkboy, right? Or how we used to take apart radios to see how things worked. Could these actually be used for, like, for instance, now with like scanning the signal that your keys make for your car? Could I essentially use this and
I think very easily.
and take a single car? Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. So you could hack somebody's smart lock in their home or apartment. We forget how easy it is. If you want to break into someone's apartment, those doors typically in most apartments are something you could kick through without really startling the neighbors. And that's the security system that's there. And so just because something's possible doesn't mean everyone's going to run around. But it's like, it is interesting when these things become trendy in a way. I think, Sid, we've talked about how like in 2019, started hearing about scam rap, and how like where other crimes, selling drugs, etc., were the sort of the point of pride in hip hop. Around that time, it became this like scene out of Detroit, mainly called of scam rap, and it was like about scammers, to the point that even Beyonce references scammers in one of her songs. And it's people, doing credit card fraud and kind of bragging about it and talking about the methods in the same way that Master P had a song about, how to cook crack, and step by step. They're kind of giving the step by step of like, this is how I perpetrated a credit card fraud and ordered things from Amazon and had them delivered and whatever. And it goes all the way through it. I mean, and those are really interesting too, because the penalties, because of the drug war and all these things, the penalties for things like manufacturing and selling drugs are so harsh compared to those for identity fraud. It's just like a crime that one can commit with far less risk. So I don't know, side point, but it's the point is just like when these things start to become appealing,
like toy-like, right? Like I think where there's a will, there's a way. Whether you're exposed to it or not, if you want to do something badly enough, it doesn't have to be a toy. You'll find some way or shape or form of accessing the thing you need to do, the thing that you want to do. But I think what's so bizarre about this is I want to be in the room where they're like, okay, here we have the signal scanner, but what about Tamagotchis? Remember that like relationship we had to these digital pets where we had to care for them, love them, and if we didn't care for them, love them, they die? Well, we're going to put that into this like signal receiver. And it's sort of like this innocent buddy who's like walking you through how to do these, to steal a signal from a car key and just like, usher you into the process of like, hey, you could steal a car if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, like if that's the purpose or if it's just like, we have this thing. It's not really doing well, but Tamagotchis do really well. So let's put those two things together and I'm sure people will love it. Cause I'm looking at like the star rating. It's like 4.9 across the board. There's not like a low star rating of this thing. And I don't know if it's like appeal to the nostalgia of the virtual pet that's making this thing so popular, or if it's actually the capability of it itself and what it's able to do that people are really like going after it. Like, would an actual hacker be like, I want this? Or is an actual hacker looking at this and being like, no, this is ridiculous. Like, but it'll improve our fan base. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think about with this is just that the little character is a dolphin. Dolphins are famously known for being incredibly intelligent and also like quite malicious in the sea world, but they're still cute and beloved at the same time. And
It's perfect.
it makes me think about like the cuteness of other weapons, basically, like pink brass knuckles or, a little thing of pepper spray that you attach to your keychain that also has like one of those little fluffy like, stuffed animal plush things on it, like just like almost like ironic, or I don't know, there's some type of like playfulness, like, yeah, like I'm cute and this is a toy, but also I could be very dangerous. And there's like a tension there that I think the internet really likes too, And I wonder if that's partly the appeal of this thing is like that. We're talking about it, but just to bring in those other examples, like the tension between cuteness and violence feels like a very popular intersection on the internet,
Yeah.
In a sense, in a way. I have this in my bag. You go through it, they're not going to question what it is. It's just a little game or something,
Looks like a little toy.
Yeah.
So I think that's like part of it too is just it feels, it makes sense that certain devices in my home that I never thought could be hacked into, like everything you get hacked into. So in a way, it's also pointing out how everything is dangerous as well and like could be seen too as like maybe a protector for that, or at least bringing that to your awareness that certain devices that are seemingly low tech in your house, like, or you might want to know that can be like a vulnerability.
Yeah. Daniel, what you said about it being this educational thing, I think that's very true. And I think that if I had a kid or whatever, a nephew, some young person that I knew was in high school or younger and was like, had this and was like using it and really into it and stuff like that, I think I would be pretty encouraging of it overall. Like just certain conversations that it would be important to have and like understand what the risks that some of these things are not a game and whatever. But, I wouldn't really be worried about this because if the kid's going to get in trouble, they're going to get in trouble doing something else, if not this. Whereas this is like, there's a lot to explore and understand about just how the world works. And plus, I think you could take on all kinds of interesting projects that have to do with networks. You might need this if you're designing your own network of things, and it needs to be secure in some way. Like it is a valid tool. I don't think there's like any real strong argument that it should be illegal, but there might be an argument about whether it should be branded in this way that I think you nailed it, Sid, with the dolphin sort of thing. It's like, that might be exactly the idea. Secretly dangerous, friendly face. So signal or noise? Sid, what do you think?
It's a signal of the commercialization of hacking, of the power shifting into more people's hands, of the literacy of digital networked devices, the vulnerabilities of them. I guess it could be a signal of like wider adoption of this technology, which is still like, despite its popularity on TikTok, is still fairly niche, Yeah. So I suppose it could be what I think about in the evolution of this is like, is this just like a VPN kind of thing where it's like all of us now probably have a VPN, just to like protect ourselves and be able to download all of season 2 of The Bear and like whatever else you want to do on the internet. Like is this going to become kind of ubiquitous in that same way where like, yeah, you can use a VPN to do some shady shit, but like most of the time you're just using it so that you can like watch the show without getting your buying Netflix or whatever,
Right. That's a great point. Yeah. I like that. Daniel, what do you think?
It's part of this growing need to understand the technology that we're using. And this is sort of like an accessory to that. It's something that's making accessible understanding how these signals work, the implications of and it's bringing it to a different market, perhaps. Yeah, I think it's part of that realm.
Signal. Julienne?
Yeah, I'd agree for similar sentiments. I mean, the literacy around hacking and safety and tech is, I think, relevant. And I would say that while it already exists, like if I purchased this thing, I wouldn't know if like I'm making an investment or I'm wasting my money. So in a way, that feels a little bit like a signal because I don't yet know whether something like this would even be helpful. I can't quite tell what I'd learn from this or given the learner that I am, if it would be easy for me to learn. You can always do your YouTube education, but for that reason, I feel like it has signal vibes.
Yeah, I guess for me, the signal would be like, would we start to see more widespread application of something like this where people are noticing vulnerabilities that may come from whatever vendor, provider, manufacturer that, created their security system, the manufacturer of their car, whatever it is, and start to find these critical vulnerabilities. And then there's like a disclosure thing, right? Just like notify the company, because if you publish it, then all of a sudden everybody knows. And so that's a whole thing within the communities of like white hat hackers of like, what are the protocols for doing that kind of thing? But yeah, is that what is going to come? Is it more like, okay, citizen cybersecurity or something where this leads to? And I don't even want to get into the intersection between this and the previous signal, but intercepting your signals from someone's brain as you cruise by them or whatever.
Rob! Oh, I didn't think about that at all. Fuck.
It's probably better we did it. There's so much scary stuff we could talk about on the, like, let's just assume that the stuff they was mentioned on the cybersecurity podcast that I listened to was like, you could hack into a whole fleet of refrigerated trucks and completely disrupt the food supply of a city or something. Like, it's just like, it was dark and scary. But they were also pro the device, just on the rich of like, yeah, this is what you need as a professional or whatever. It's just a tool. Anyway, Julienne, what's your weakest signal?
All right. We kind of made a transition there with the food truck. It's related to some of the research I was conducting for the food podcast. I've been kind of in that land of research for a while. So in episode 2 of the podcast, we discussed science of food, touching on cultivated protein, 3D printed meat, nutrigenetics, stuff like that. And we spoke to a company called BHEX, who they're known for like working with NASA to get funding to 3D print pizza in space, which is actually really complicated given like gravity, all that. But they've developed the technology recently to turn a recyclable plastic bottle into a protein biomass that's edible. So you might say a steak, if you want to call it that. But basically, we were talking to the co-founder. He went into some awesome detail about it. But you melt down a plastic bottle and you get like 3 different types of materials. And what you'd imagine would be like the clearish, yellowish liquid. That's what you use. And then there's a certain type of bacteria that can feed off of that and then multiply and feed and multiply and feed. And then you end up with a biomass. So I feel like the fact that this type of tech exists kind of blew my mind. I think for obvious reasons, we then quickly went into discussions with him about, consumer acceptance and barriers to that. So like where this would even go might be nowhere. But like my first reaction was like, I would never eat that. I would never take a bite out of that. And then to play devil's advocate with myself, I was kind of thinking like, well, what is like the most questionable thing I've eaten that doesn't resemble any ingredient that I can recognize, that contains ingredients that are just a bunch of letters strung together that I don't know what it is. I've certainly consumed microplastics in my water before, for sure. And so I think that kind of got me down thinking about this, like what's even in my food. Part of food futures is like reverting to like back to the earth type of movements. And then you have this seemingly contrast of like, well, we can't always go back to the earth with resource depletion. So we're looking to innovation. And I think that like there's like a certain level of, is knowing what's in something enough, like just the name of it, or how do I explore like what's good for me personally? And so I think that like there's just a growing contrast between these technological advancements and innovation with transparency and kind of some of the other stuff we've spoken to, like what's the transparency behind this type of tech? And I just feel like there's this growing urgency for accessible, transparent information around these new scientific innovations in food to really understand what we're putting into our bodies and what we're feeling. And like that gap is already huge. Like there's already a huge mis and disinformation around every topic, but especially nutrition. You have like new programs out, what it's called, that, you know, doctors can prescribe fruits and vegetables to people. Like there's already so much like education gap that like, how are these like advancements in food tech like muddying those waters? So that's kind of what I got. There's also like some interesting tech that I was looking at, like molecular tagging. So mole tagging, where it's like a couple years ago, there's this startup called Porcupine that used DNA tagging of products as like an alternative to barcodes. Basically, it's like a portable device that in theory you can just read like dehydrated strands of synthetic DNA and like maybe to verify that a certain type of cotton is organic or whatever. And so like on one side of things, perhaps dystopian, like are the future ingredients we're going to be consuming, do they need that type of like verification that they are what they are because we can't recognize it anymore? Or would something like that be actually user friendly and accessible to help educate us about like what's in our food? And would that sort of a device be, I don't know, useful? So they're kind of like two signals that I felt like were maybe not signals, data points. We'll start there.
So this is 3D printed pizza people who did it. B-Hacks? I remember that well. And I always remember being like, you picked the most 2D food to 3D print. And it was
Yeah. I don't know where this tech is going to go. I know it's going to go somewhere, but
I'm thinking about the second part of what you brought up, like the molecular tagging. And I think that businesses across different industries have tried to increase consumer understanding of supply chain, essentially. It kind of like unsuccessfully, you know, like there's like a brand of olive oil that I buy sometimes, and there's like a QR code on it. And it's like, track me. And I'm like, I don't fucking give a shit. I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to open it and it's going to take me to some webpage. It's like a blog article about how this came from Italy or didn't come from Italy or came from Vermont or didn't come from, like, I don't care. I'm not going to do that. And like, I remember when Everlane first came out, their whole thing was like transparency. I think that they've kind of moved away from this a little bit, but you used to be able to go onto their site and click on like a pair of jeans, and then you could see the address of the exact factory where the buttons and the zipper and the whatever came from, you know? And like both of these examples, like the QR code and the olive oil and the addresses of the button factory, like they feel performative to me, you know, like, oh, that you can do this doesn't necessarily mean that anyone is doing this, you know? And like, what problem is that solving? You know, like, so if I could read the molecular tags on my apple or my smoothie apple, whatever the word is that I'm looking for, like from 2050 or whatever, when it's not even like I can read the tag and I'll be like, oh, this was once an apple. Johnny, do you remember what apples are? Like, it's, I guess maybe in that stage it'd be helpful, but like, is providing the information in that way really solving the problem? You know, and what is actually the problem that we're trying to solve? That like food production is so opaque that we don't know what we're eating and where it's from. And I don't know if that's really solved by education. That's solved by better food production. Like that, you know, it's kind of like this, it's kind of like the most superficial, you know, solution is like, oh, we're just going to tell them where it's from. It's like, actually just grow it in a better fucking place, you know, and then I wouldn't be so distressed about having this information.
So what if like in a scenario you had, because right now, like the things exist, whether they're good or bad, they exist. And your willingness to understand where they come from comes from like, hey, I can tell someone or feel good about myself for having consumed better. But what if it was, in a way, the purchase, like how things are made and where things are made are dependent on if they're bought or not to a certain extent, right? So the only power that we hold is purchasing. So if it exists, we could choose to buy it or not buy it. And so in that future, which I think you're talking about of like in the present, like the lazy consumer that doesn't care, is just like, I'm hungry now, I want to eat this thing. How do you create filters that sort of, it's like, I want to consume better. I'm going to dial up these things so to be a better consumer. And so don't show me anything that's this and show me all those things that are that, which maybe in that future, let's be honest. I mean, we're living it now. A lot of our consumption and how we buy and purchase comes online. So if this were to be plugged into places where I only have only the things that are molecularly tagged with products that are good and I feel good about eating, that's all that will show up. And that's something I choose to prescribe to. And then everything else, you manufacture, you can make it, but I won't see it. That's the only kind of thing I can start to see is like in this lazy consumer, I don't care what it is world, having another form of filter that just sort of takes stuff out of the equation. I don't know.
Doesn't that like take the responsibility off of like food production systems? Yeah, I can choose to buy better, but like essentially by buying better, I just have to buy more expensive things. And like every year they just become more expensive with more labels of like, it's organic. And I got these eggs the other day and they're like, it was so precariously worded that I was like, hens that enjoy the outside. What does that mean?
They said that?
Hens that enjoy the outside. I was like, well, I enjoy Bermuda, but I'm not there all the time. Like, what does that mean? And so when even the example that you gave, you're like, oh, I want like apples that are molecularly coded to be good. Like, it's like we don't even have the language. What does organic even mean? Organic is like it's like a codified word that like you have to pay to play. Like you have to pay to certify your farm as organic, right? So like, and what do I even know what organic means? Does that just mean apples that enjoy the sunlight? Like I don't know what that means, So like it is continuously evading the center of the problem, which is that like you can tell me this is good, but you can tell me this is organic, you can tell me this is natural, but like literally what do these words mean? It's like I'm still not getting to the root of it, Like I shouldn't have to know so much about the certification of organic food to feel good about eating this thing. Like this is like you're selling me another problem, instead of actually getting to the root of it.
I agree with that, Sid. And in terms of also just like what's realistic in terms of like, yeah, you can be all the way transparent, but people got lives to live and stuff to do. I do think like interventions that ask us or force us to interface more directly with the processes that produce our food are a good thing generally. And it's good to find ways to do that where you can, because we are so distant from the process. What I think is maybe a problem is that we're way too quick, and maybe just this is a symptom of lack of time and energy and attention for learning the whole process. We're way too quick to make a judgment of like good or bad. And there's so much of this like kind of greenwashing, organic washing, and supply chain washing or whatever that happens to kind of exploit the lack of attention and time that people have to look at this. Yeah, that's a real problem. But I still think like, yeah, if where you can, it's good to try to better understand these things and interface more directly with what you're eating.
Like this is exactly the train of thought that I've gone down, and like this food supplies chain is so difficult and deeply flawed that it's like I kind of started being like, well, might as well eat a bite of that plastic steak. I'd probably do it anyway. I don't know. There was like this feeling of like I want to give up because I don't know what it means to buy organic anymore. To your point, Sid, like it's almost this, do I even care anymore attitude? I think it's tiring because the systems of understanding what's what anymore are just so blurry. But
yeah, I just like to not sort of be willfully delusional about it. Like I want to confront the fact that it's like, this beautiful looking steak is dyed red and glued together, and that's what it is. And is that bad or good? It's not bad or good. It's a presentation. That's a choice that's been made. It's a form. Like it's a matter of form and branding, and it makes it look more delicious because of biological factors of like me wanting to eat something that's red or whatever. That's what it is. But I'd like to be as aware as possible of these things and not just kind of neglect knowing about them.
Like, I'm all for education and learning about, where your food came from and blah, blah, blah. But like, the problem is that these gradations of quality in food that we just have to accept year over year. Like, it's organic, it's non-GMO, it's blah, 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 it's blah, 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 it's blah, blah, blah. Like, they are not, in my opinion, increasing the quality of the food. They are just like allowing for like a low, like it's a race to the bottom a little bit. Like the $12 eggs may be marginally better than the $6 eggs, but like maybe that just like allows the $3 eggs to be like the worst thing possible. I don't know. It feels like these labels of quality that are meant to be educational tools for me to reclaim my food are actually, they're just like marketing devices, like funneling me into more and more expensive purchases.
I mean, at the end of the day, we still have to, we have so many literal mouths to feed, so whether it's a $3 egg, a $6 egg, a $12 egg, there's still a bottom line that needs to be met in a way, so to speak. And that's the problem, right? If we could grow our own things, because an egg from the farm, believe it or not, tastes so much better than a lot of the eggs that you get in stores, like from a real farm. But you need to have that time and infrastructure and knowledge and space to money. Yes. Yeah. Right.
It's not feasible environmentally or anything to have everyone eating sort of the best treated free range chicken. Yeah.
The chickens who enjoy the outside.
Yeah. No, some of these chickens need to enjoy the inside.
My chickens are inside chickens. I don't know about your chickens. I'm kidding.
They're homebodies. They like Netflix. But that's why what's so interesting about plastic steaks, like I'm curious, right? Like it's sort of what we've done to ourselves. Like we now need to eat our waste. It's poetry in a way.
Yeah. Julian, you were kind of like illustrating how it diverges from like the back to the earth movement. I'm like, well, in some ways, this is the most literal back to the earth. Like this is what we did to the fucking earth. So go back, like, you made your bed, you got to lie in it now, like, let's not pretend that the earth is this like sanctified, pure thing anymore. Like we poisoned the earth. So like, put your bib on, babe, let's go. Like,
and how can we like pretend that there are two narratives, right? Like, I think that's also part of the reason why I kept just going back and saying like, well, probably eating things just as worse or done things maybe equally close to worse for my health. Like, how do you even quantify? I don't know the answer, but it kind of stuck out as like ironic. I'm to the point where we're making food out of what you'd put in a landfill. Like,
imagine, I mean, there's the Pink Floyd song, you have to eat your pudding before you eat your meat. Now it's going to be like, can't have your cake before you eat your plastic.
Yeah. I mean, definitely feels Orwellian. Like there's like in 1984, there's like no blueberries, it's like, those are like precious, no real chocolate anymore, like it's.
There's like a theme or a tension that keeps coming up for me recently. That's like, I guess I'd phrase it as, do we need this kind of ridiculous excess in order to fund progress or make it happen? And when I think of like big food, I think it gets kind of a bad rep, or it's by many, we overlook just how incredible what's been done in terms of the abilities to create a lot of food with very little energy. And that's true. But then that comes with, in order to do that, or despite having figured so much out in terms of being able to produce a lot of food with relatively very little, we have like the excess that we see, and so much food that's produced with very little nutritional value. And you just have to go into any major grocery store and you can just think like, most of this is not stuff any of us need. Most of this is pretty shitty as a product. Like we could be doing so much better with the actual technology that's been developed. But because of many of the same forces that developed all that technology, they're forced to compete. And then it creates this sort of like excess. How cheap and badly can we make something that is addictive that people want to consume over and over and over again? And that's happened very quickly. And, the optionality and everything has grown very fast. And like this seems to happen across any sort of technology space. It's like, look at blockchain technology. It's like, okay, underlying really interesting technology. Could that be happening if it weren't for like the nonsense NFTs and like pumping coins like that are basically funding that engineering at the expense of people's gambling addictions, essentially. And so there's like, is this always necessary to justify these things, or is there some sort of more balanced way that we can maneuver these forces to get better outcomes than we do? Because it always seems like such a simplified argument by like, no, the system we're in has gotten us here. Our life expectancies have extended. We have healthcare, but then it's like, okay, but look at the healthcare system, how that's actually working. Yes, there's so much remarkable stuff happening. And then look at how it's deployed, and look at all of the really fucked up ways that, drugs are developed, not to help people, but to, keep people buying them.
Which is food, right? I mean, that's in essence a lot of the food that we consume. I mean,
Yeah.
it is in a form a drug with the addictive nature of a lot of foods that we're exposed to consume. And I mean, if we look at like the epidemic that we have upon us, and that will affect us greatly, and it's diabetes.
Right. But the part where you're trying to drive demand in food, everybody needs it. The demand is built in here. So the idea that you're doing any work to market and drive demand for food at all, it's like, you just look at my barber, just think of it. He doesn't try to drive demand for haircuts. We come back at once a month, like it's the same, like food has more of that built in, you know what I mean? And there's like very few industries left like that, like barbershops, where people are just like, no, it's like a thing. People need it. They come back. Like it's consistent. Like we don't really do a lot of marketing and promotion. We just do our job. But it's like this thing where it's to get the progress that you need this kind of access.
Yeah. It's also progress needed to feed the amount of mouths that currently inhabit the planet, and have a market share on that, right? I want everyone to be eating my food, not their food, which is ridiculous.
Exactly.
It's almost, and sometimes you get caught up on what exact type of egg am I buying versus like, am I getting enough protein in my day, or am I getting enough nutrients? So like some of this funding for this crazy innovations like waste to food, it's like, where's the customization built in? How are we figuring out like that complex and deeply personalized issue of like what people actually need a combination of, and consistency and moderation versus getting in the weeds with precise sourcing of ingredients? It's like, slippery slope. And sometimes, I think that would be one of my biggest gripes with some of the tech in food that's coming out now.
That's, it feels like we have too much time and not enough purpose, because we have like, if we go back to like thinking about, I think sitting here talking about death and our unhealthy relationship to death, like food, we have to eat, and we all have to die. These are inevitable truths in our lives, whether it's on a daily or over a lifespan. But they seem to be the things that we mess up the most. And it's almost because either we can't reconcile it, or we don't have enough time to consider it, or consider its relationship to us, or we have too much time to think about the relationship that is eating and dying. I don't know what it is, but it's funny how these simple facts, these simple realities, simple truths become corrupted the most. And I wonder if it's because of that. Everyone must eat, everyone must die. Therefore, it's like you said, everyone must get their hair cut. Maybe barbers are next. It's food, death, and barbers that will become corrupted.
Food, death, and barbers. That's like the new sex, death, and money. It does really feel like I understand like the magical, fantastic amount of thinking and work that has gone into making plastic into an edible steak. And yet I still roll my eyes at it, because like there are just like food deserts in major cities. And I'm like, that feels just like a little bit more pressing than like, and these are not the same people. Like the person who's making, plastic steaks or whatever is not going to go solve putting a normal grocery store in the middle of Brooklyn or something, right? Like it's
maybe, but maybe not.
But like, it just, I don't know. I'm just like, we're really not even past step 1 yet. And we're already like jumping ahead to step 30. Like we have very basic problems that have not been solved. And it just feels like an exorbitant waste to be investing time and money and energy into these like future issues when like we have actual very pressing, very solvable issues right now that are not being addressed, you know?
But can you monetize them?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And it's not like a sexy thing to put a grocery store in the middle of Brooklyn. Like it's a sexy thing to turn plastic into steak, you know? Like
Exactly. Like, I think that's such as the flaw of innovation is like, if it's not sexy, is it even innovative? Why do we have to go to these lengths? And, I think that is very much something that like was on my mind when thinking about this.
Yeah, I think this is a signal of a problem about problems. The signal is about how we conceive of problems, and that we're doing something wrong in that regard. And like Sid, you meant like, absolutely. It's like, isn't this a problem we already solved by being able to produce enough food? And now there's this other thing, equitable distribution of food, which like, just as you were telling it, Sid, you're like, yeah, it's not the same people, but it's like, well, maybe it should be, it could be like, if the engineering minds that are putting work into this, we're putting work into producing like resilient networks that ensure equitable distribution of food around the world, like that might be a harder, a more ambitious, more interesting problem. I'm sure the people doing this are brilliant, so maybe that's something that they would want to take on, but it seems like we kind of keep looking to make our problems about creating the antidote to the problem we just created, and this is just like this very obvious cycle that keeps happening, and we keep making the same flawed predictions too. Like somebody just recently said it because of LLMs and ChatGPT and AI. I think it was like some hedge fund manager or something said like, well, predicted a 3-day work week within 10 years or whatever. And it was like, well, we've had this degree of efficiencies created. We've had this degree of automation created in the past. Like, yes, if we want, like, but it's not like work's going to disappear any more than it has in the past because of the way we conceive of problems, I think.
Yeah, it is really just like the industry of innovation, like the industry of problem solving, like kind of creates the problems it's like a vacuum and it just like needs more problems. Like it's like Pac-Man and it eats problems. Like, and it's like made to like design problems or something like that. It's just like, it doesn't feel like any of them have gotten solved, like it just feels like we're coming up with better, presentations of what the problem is, but like the industry of innovation needs more problems to stay afloat, right? So it's like incentivized by the wrong things. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily incentivized by solutions. It's incentivized by problems.
Or degrowth. Like, there's always like this additive, something new, like, and that's this thing futures and foresight, I think, is being constantly trying to get others and even sometimes catch yourself with like innovation is a lot of times just about like choosing not to design something, choosing not to make something, like degrowth, like
this, like the industry of new problems sums it up beautifully in this perpetual cycle that we find ourselves in. It's like constant need to like prove ourselves relevant in a way. When what happens if we just stop?
Signal or noise, Daniel?
I don't know. I have no idea.
It's a fake question. It's a trick question anyways.
Yeah.
I'm the signal and noise. It's a noisy signal.
Right. Yeah, it depends on the frame. I think I'm in the same boat. Sid, what do you think?
The molecular coding thing is a signal of how far we'd strayed from the real issues of life. I don't know. I think something like that. Yeah. It's a signal of the direction that like funding is going in, or just like has been going in, but not necessarily a signal of the type of innovation that we need, I feel.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a signal for me. Like I said, signal of the problem we have with conceiving of our problems and knowing how to address them. But I really like the way you paired it and brought those two together. Broadcast from later. Thanks, everyone. That was great. Thanks for staying a little longer. That was a really nice discussion.
Yeah, it was great. Like, so good.
It was so good to understand like how you all think a little bit deeper. And yeah, I think that these sorts of conversations, you can just learn so much more about someone than the surface level stuff. So I really enjoyed it.
Tell us all what you learned about how we think.
Or like, I mean, helping me think is also a good signal and weigh into that. It's like, if I can talk with someone about this type of stuff, chances are we might get along. We might have fun in real life.
I was having a weird, like in the beginning, experience because Rob, I talked to you before. I followed a lot of these episodes in the past, and it's like meeting your like these Sid, like hearing you and you're saying like, and now it is so bizarre. It's like, is that me?
I think about all of the fucked up signals that I've brought in over the years. I'm like,
So good though.
sometimes I forget that people actually watch this, and it's not just like a thing that I do with Rob and Jeremy like every couple months. Like I forget that this. Like, I saw the one from last week or the week before it came out, and I was like, why did I do that? Like, why was that my signal?
They're just so weird to watch it in review. They're just like, I'm just like, is this intelligible to anybody? Like, what is this?
I don't know. The jury's still out on that part, I think.
Do you find these help in a way, like, or at least whether it's in the moment processing thoughts and ideas or looking back and seeing how things have evolved? Because I mean, you've done this how many years now? Like a few years.
Yeah, I think we started it in early 2020, just before the pandemic. And then I think when the pandemic happened, that's when we kind of were like, oh, we might as well ramp it up a little bit.
I find it helpful, just the skill of deciphering worlds that you're not a part of. The signals that get brought in every episode are from so vastly different disciplines and just like fields that I like. It's just kind of like an exercise in like mental agility to just be like, okay, I don't know 7 of the 10 words that were just said, but like I think I'm starting to understand, what this is, and can I then contextualize that in something in my world? And that's the interesting thing in the episodes, I feel, is like taking your signal, bringing it into my world. You take my signal, bring it into your world, and that cross pollination makes the conversation more interesting. It
reminds me a little bit of there's these the new commonplace books. They're sort of like journals, diaries in like the 16th century. I think even back in the Romans, they used them. Like Marcus Aurelius used these journals as a way to kind of keep tabs of bits and pieces of information that were interesting or relevant to that individual. It could be like grocery lists, thoughts of the day, things that happened, whatever. And these commonplace books, because they were bits and pieces and fragments of information, because they were compiled by an individual, they're almost these bits and pieces of information became almost new because they were newly interpreted, or new connections were made because they were put in relation to other disparate forms of information that otherwise wouldn't have been, so in a way it reminds me of this, like sense making outside of like these microcosms where these nuggets of information come from, and these cross sections almost create a new sense in a way, or new connections.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in like somewhat randomly putting disparate ideas in close proximity and what can come out of that, because there's always some kind of connection, and sometimes that's where you have to be forced to find like the more unobvious ones. And yeah, to me, the answer to your other question before, like, is it helpful or whatever? For me, the way it's helpful is that I just find themes emerge over time. And so we did this video, how the web is changing recently. And like many of those terms that we put out there, there's like a whole, that was a lexicon that formed mostly over the course of this podcast. And a lot of the examples came in. So they were like these individual things, but then clustered together, they start to make sense and become like a thematic territory that could be talked about in an actual like coherent way, and something that's probably much more valuable to a listener, and like actually instead of listening for an hour and hearing like there's a bunch of random ideas, is like 10 minutes where, you know what I mean? If you're looking for like the payoff of your attention, you probably get a lot more.
It's great that you do that. Yeah, it's amazing.
I also think, to Julienne's point, that there's something really interesting about like getting to know people through these conversations. Like they can be so unwieldy and esoteric, and it's just like, to me, such a more fascinating icebreaker that elicits some strong emotions. It shows people's anxieties. It like shows their comfort zones, like how people habitually interpret information versus how other people find novelty in it. Like it's always unexpected what the signals will be and how other people will come to them.
There's a cool practice, I guess, I find, where it's like, I always find I'm resisting making any kind of like moral or political judgment about the thing that I'm hearing, but at the same time, noticing like how those are coming up, noticing the feelings arising about like, because there's always an instinct, and it's usually I articulate it, but I'm also like, why am I feeling that? What does that have to do with the signal? Why is that the first thing?
Even like it's absolutely, you're just all generalists because it's a window into yourself of like, I can breathe. I'm not the only one who's anxious about this or has no idea what the hell that is. Like, is weirded out or excited by this random thing. And I think there needs to be more of that. Like, being a generalist is part of foresight in so many ways. And I think I was trained to like view that as not as useful. Yeah, I don't agree with that, of course, anymore. But I was like, there's no foresight degree, you know? There's a reason why this isn't really taught that much, because it's such a new way of thinking.
It's funny to reflect too, like even just the signal we were discussing, it's like we all had this feeling that came up, but it's like, as I think back, I'm like, oh, well, on the other hand, maybe this is the technology that's going to save the world. Like they've got like a combination of technologies. Like that's the other thing there, that if you have like plastic eating bacteria producing food for humanity, like did we gloss over that part where it's amazing?
I know, that's amazing.
Like
that's insane.
Yeah.
Like at that point, it's like, who cares what it tastes like? Like that's you just have to.
My chickens enjoy plastic steaks, like
and indoors.
Indoors,
Netflix
from their bunkers.
Plastic pellets.
It's not a plastic steak, okay? It's a microbial feces steak from a plastic-fed microbial, right?
Apparently, I have a lot of details with this guy. He got really just science brain went way into it. He's like, you know, it smells like strongly of like kind of metallic, and it's like thick. It was like 4 inches thick, and we didn't know how to cook it. And it was just like, and it tasted like this. And then afterwards, he's like, but you know, of course, no one ate it. And I'm like, you totally took a bite of that. What are you talking about?
Of course, you ate it.
Sounds horrible, though.
It was lovely.
Thank you for that.
Anyway.
Yes, great to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.